All right, guys, so this is going to be the last podcast for the nervous system, and this is just going to finish up the last couple of pages of the chapter. But this is some, just different information, so I thought it would be nice to differentiate it out. So we're going to talk about the autonomic versus the somatic pathways, and we're going to talk about the different types of divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so here in the somatic pathway, the neuron's cell body lies within the central nervous system. Okay, so here's the cell body, okay, in the central nervous system, in the spinal cord here. A single myelinated axon extends from the brainstem or spinal cord to a skeletal muscle. So here's the long axon, okay, here it's myelinated. Okay, at the target muscle, the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, ACH, is released to cause muscle contraction. So that's a somatic pathway, right? Attached to skeletal muscle. In the autonomic pathway, what happens is we have a myelinated preganglionic neuron extending from the brainstem or spinal cord to a ganglion. So here it is. Very similar looking, okay? This is a preganglionic because here's the ganglion they're calling it, okay? So here you see there's actually two different neurons versus the somatic pathway, there's only one, okay? In the ganglion, it's synapses with a post-ganglionic neuron, this one here, so preganglionic neuron, post-ganglionic neuron. But what happens here is there's a synapsis, so we have a neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, is released here to stimulate this post-ganglionic neuron. The axon of the unmyelinated postganglionic neuron extends to the target organ. So here it's showing you the heart is the target organ. The neurotransmitter released at the target organ varies. Parasympathetic fibers release acetylcholine, whereas sympathetic fibers release norepinephrine, which we're going to talk about in just a couple of slides. If you look on page 186 at the bottom of the book, or bottom of the page, excuse me, there's a comparison of somatic and automatic nervous system. So you need to know these and commit those to memory. Two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, okay, or the autonomic pathway, all right. The sympathetic prepares the body for activity. It's this fight or flight reaction. It's called on in times of stress, anger, or fear. Parasympathetic is kind of the opposite of that and calms bodily functions. So both the sympathetic and parasympathetic division work at the same time, providing a background level of activity called autonomic tone. The balance between these two constantly changes depending on the body's needs. So sometimes the sympathetic is acting more than the parasympathetic or vice versa. However, neither of these ever stop working. Just one works more than the other. If you look on page 187, it really divides these two systems out and really talks about the differences. And again, you need to know these. So in the sympathetic division, we have increased alertness, increased heart rate. We have dilated bronchial tubes to increase airflow to the lungs, dilated blood vessels to increase blood flow, inhibits intestinal motility because we certainly don't need intestinal motility when we're trying to run from a bear. Stimulates secretion of thick salivary mucus, stimulates sweat glands, stimulates adrenal glands, and has no effect on the urinary bladder internal sphincter. If you ever have a question or you're thinking about, okay, is this sign or symptom a part of the sympathetic or the parasympathetic, think about what's happening inside your body when a bear is chasing you. It's just an example, but certainly your sympathetic system is in full force if that's happening. Versus parasympathetic is more like when we're sleeping or when we're just relaxing. So decreased heart rate, constrict bronchial tubes to decrease airflow to the lungs, no real effect on the blood vessels, stimulates intestinal motility and secretion to promote digestion, stimulates secretion of thin salivary mucus, no effect on the sweat glands, no effect on the adrenal medulla, and it stimulates the bladder wall to contract. So this is really our kind of resting and digesting phase. I'm going to show you an animation. Let's see.
The sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system prepares the body for physical activity. It is also responsible for the fight or flight reaction that occurs during times of extreme stress. The sympathetic division is also called the thoracolumbar division because it arises from the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. From the cell bodies in the spinal cord, myelinated fibers reach to sympathetic ganglia, most of which exist in chains along both sides of the spinal cord. Because the ganglia lie close to the spinal cord, the preganglionic neurons are short. Not all preganglionic neurons synapse in the first ganglion they encounter. Some travel up or down the chain to synapse with other ganglia at different levels. Others pass through the first ganglion to synapse with another ganglion a short distance away. Unmyelinated postganglionic fibers leave the ganglia and extend to the target organs. Postganglionic fibers tend to be long. Each preganglionic neuron of the sympathetic division branches and synapses with multiple postganglionic neurons. This arrangement allows one preganglionic neuron to excite multiple postganglionic neurons simultaneously. That is why the sympathetic division can ignite such an immediate, widespread response.
So what they're saying basically is these are the preganglionic neurons, okay? These are the postganglionic neurons, which you need to know, okay? And these are often very short. These are often very long. And also the important piece that I want you to take note of here is that they're saying that one preganglionic neuron can really excite or stimulate multiple postganglionic neurons. That's what gives us this immediate fight or flight response when, say, a bear comes out of nowhere and starts chasing us. One other thing that plays a role in the sympathetic nervous system is the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys. And what happens is the sympathetic preganglionic fibers pass through the outer cortex of the adrenal gland and terminate in the center. When stimulated, the adrenal medulla secretes a mixture of epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. Both of these hormones can bind to the receptors of the sympathetic effectors, which helps prolong the sympathetic response. Basically, what I want you to know here is that these preganglionic fibers go through the adrenal gland. So when the preganglionic fibers are stimulated in the sympathetic nervous system, we get epinephrine and norepinephrine released, which actually causes and elicits even a bigger reaction from the sympathetic system. So it just kind of helps our sympathetic nervous system. All right, so let's watch the animation then on the parasympathetic division. Remember, this is our resting and digesting nervous system.
The parasympathetic division has a calming effect on body functions. The neurons of the parasympathetic division arise from the brain and the sacral region of the spinal cord, which is why this division of the autonomic nervous system is also called the craniosacral division. Parasympathetic fibers leave the brainstem by joining the oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, or vagus nerves. A few fibers also arise from the sacral region of the spinal cord. The oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 3, carries parasympathetic fibers to the ciliary muscle, which thickens the lens of the eye, and to the pupillary constrictor, which constricts the pupil. Parasympathetic fibers carried in the facial nerve, or cranial nerve 7, regulate the tear glands, salivary glands, and nasal glands. Parasympathetic fibers carried in the glossopharyngeal nerve, or cranial nerve 9, trigger salivation. The vagus nerve, or cranial nerve 10, carries about 90% of all parasympathetic preganglionic fibers. It travels from the brain to organs in the thoracic cavity, including the lungs, esophagus, and heart, and the abdominal cavity, such as the liver, stomach, spleen, pancreas, kidneys, and intestines. Fibers from the sacral region travel by way of pelvic nerves to portions of the colon and the bladder. The ganglia of the parasympathetic division reside in or near the target organ. As a result, the preganglionic fibers of the parasympathetic division are long, whereas the postganglionic fibers are short. Because the ganglia are more widely dispersed, The parasympathetic division produces a more localized response than that of the sympathetic division.
So I hope this helps you understand it a little bit better. You don't certainly need to know what stimulates from what cranial nerve. What I want you to know is that the preganglionic neurons are longer here and the post are shorter, and they don't get as much of a wide spread, except for here you get a lot of things being triggered, but in the sympathetic it's still a lot more things being triggered by one preganglionic neuron. Here's just, again, a chart that kind of outlines what we just talked about and a couple of last things that we're going to talk about going forward. So you can pause this and read through this if you want. Neurotransmitters. So you do need to know the different neurotransmitters. So we have cholinergic fibers and we have adrenergic fibers. Cholinergic fibers are found in the preganglionic fibers of the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. So that first neuron. They're also found in the postganglionic fibers of the parasympathetic division, and they secrete acetylcholine. Adrenergic fibers are included in most postganglionic fibers of the sympathetic division and secrete norepinephrine. So hopefully you can see the difference here. Acetylcholine is in both preganglionic fibers, but then the postganglionic fibers for the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic are different. Norepinephrine is going to give us and help us to have that fight or flight response. So here's a couple last pictures that I just kind of want to talk through quickly. And I do want to show you one last animation, even though we didn't talk about everything that's in it. Your book does talk about receptors. So we're only talking about the neurotransmitter piece, but there are different receptors as well. I don't need you to necessarily know that part of it, but I want you to, at least have been introduced to it. So here we have cholinergic fibers, the preganglionic neurons. They secrete acetylcholine. Acetylcholine binds to the nicotinic receptors on the postganglionic neurons. What happens now is most postganglionic neurons are adrenergic and secrete norepinephrine. Norepinephrine binds to alpha and beta adrenergic receptors. Occasionally, though, postganglionic neurons are cholinergic and secrete acetylcholine. Acetylcholine binds to muscarinic receptors. Okay, so we see how there's two options here. Okay, this is the part I need you to definitely know. Cholinergic fibers of preganglionic neurons secrete acetylcholine. Okay, here we have cholinergic fibers, preganglionic neurons, again, secrete acetylcholine. Acetylcholine binds to the nicotinic receptors on the postganglionic neurons. Cholinergic postganglionic neurons secrete acetylcholine, and acetylcholine binds to muscarinic receptors. So two different kind of pathways in your book. And this shows both the neurotransmitters and the receptors. So let me show you the animation. Hopefully it'll make more sense to you. But what I need you to know is the cholinergic fibers versus the adrenergic fibers. Okay, so don't get too bogged down with it, but I want you to have at least been introduced to it.
After being released, neurotransmitters bind to receptors on effector cells of target organs. Specifically, acetylcholine binds to cholinergic receptors, and norepinephrine binds to adrenergic receptors. Within these two categories of receptors are several subtypes of receptors. It is the type of receptor that determines the effect produced by a neurotransmitter. Preganglionic neurons in both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system secrete acetylcholine. Once released, acetylcholine may bind to either nicotinic receptors or muscarinic receptors. Cells with nicotinic receptors are excited by acetylcholine. Cells with muscarinic receptors exhibit a variable response to acetylcholine. Some are excited, whereas others are inhibited. After being secreted, acetylcholine binds to nicotinic receptors on the postganglionic neuron. This excites the next neuron. The postganglionic fibers in the parasympathetic division are also cholinergic, which means that these fibers also secrete acetylcholine. The acetylcholine secreted by postganglionic fibers of the parasympathetic division binds to muscarinic receptors on the target cell. Some cells with muscarinic receptors are excited by acetylcholine. Others are inhibited by it. In the sympathetic division, a few of the postganglionic neurons are cholinergic, meaning that they too secrete acetylcholine. The acetylcholine binds to muscarinic receptors on the target cell, where it exerts a variable response. However, most postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic division are adrenergic, meaning that they secrete norepinephrine. Norepinephrine may bind with one of two types of receptors: alpha adrenergic receptors or beta adrenergic receptors. Most cells with alpha adrenergic receptors are excited by norepinephrine. Most cells with beta adrenergic receptors are inhibited by norepinephrine. These different receptors explain the sometimes contradictory effects of the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system.
So even though I'm not asking you to memorize all these steps and all these things, I think this kind of brings it all together, what's happening in the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic system. So that's why I wanted to kind of show you this and go there. But really, I just want you to know the neurotransmitters and where they come from.